What's up, my friend? Abby here, and welcome back to Writer's Life Wednesdays. Here's today's question. Is it possible to switch or add protagonists in your story, not necessarily at the beginning, but like a little ways into the story, without losing the reader's interest? This is something that I recently had to face when I wrote my last book, because like halfway through, the main conflict for my main character is basically over, but that's when the conflict for my second protagonist steps in and takes over and becomes the main conflict. I know, that sounds confusing, lots of conflict going on. I was confused too. But mostly I was worried. I mean, is this weird to do in a story? Does it lose the interest of the reader if you're adding protagonists or switching protagonists or focusing more on subplots that become the main plot later on in the story? What is the right way to do this? That's what we're gonna find out today. Okay, so you've probably read stories with more than one protagonist. It's personally my favorite thing to write, but we're not going to be talking about following two protagonists as most alternating point of view style books are written. Not starting out with two protagonists, but I'm talking about adding a protagonist or adding a character that becomes sort of a main character, very integral to the story later on after you've already established who the story is following. That's why it seems weird. Like, is this legal? Why should the reader care about a new character when you've already established the protagonist and why we should care about them? Is it possible to make the reader care just as much about another character who steps in later but ends up stealing the spotlight? Yes, the answer is yes, and I'm going to explain how and why you can do this with your own story. But there are a few rules that you'll want to follow with this, or else you'll risk losing your reader's interest and derailing your plot. A couple weeks ago, we talked about subplots and how to write good subplots that don't steal the show, and that's kind of what you have to keep in mind here as well when adding protagonists to your story. So what are the rules? Pretty simple, just 3. Number 1, establish what the new character means to the protagonist. If they care, the reader cares. That's pretty much my rule of thumb when it comes to anything in a story. It can't matter to the reader unless it matters to the protagonist. So how does this new character matter to the protagonist? Even if your story ends up having two protagonists, I urge you to do this. Give both characters meaning to each other so that the reader has a better reason to care too. And that means only bring the new character into the story when they need to appear, when the protagonist meets them. Okay, so you're like, what? Obviously, but what I mean here is when you're adding a point of view. So it is my personal opinion that the best time to give a new character a point of view is when the protagonist meets them, or when the first character meets them. Why? Because the protagonist is our yardstick that we measure the importance of everything in the story by. So if it's important to the protagonist, if it happens to the protagonist, it happens to us. We are living in the skin of the protagonist. Now, obviously this is preference and up to the writer, and it doesn't always work in every story. For example, a story like All the Light We Cannot See, where the whole premise is basically that the two protagonists meet at pretty much the end of the book. So yeah, there are some exceptions for style, but as a general rule, I like to make it super clear to the reader why they should care about this new character and how they're going to impact the story. Which leads to rule number 3. Build the new character's conflict on the side for a while before it steps in to take the spotlight. Just like with subplots, this new character's conflict is not the main conflict of the story, even though hopefully it will be directly engaging with the main conflict of the story. This direct engagement is what makes the reader care about this new character and want to follow them home. And it's kind of tricky balancing how much of this new character's journey we should be following before they step in to take the spotlight. So the only way to really get a good feel for this is to study some good stories that do it well. And of course, it's the moment you've all been waiting for, the moment we use a story example. And what's our example going to be today? The Greatest Showman. Oh yeah, it was only a matter of time. Specifically the storyline with Philip Carlyle. Now technically this is a subplot, but I like to think of Carlyle as a protagonist in his own right, because he has a hero's journey story arc of his own happening off to the side, and as the film progresses we see more and more of his story until eventually, let's face it, we care more about him than we do about Barnum. So let's psychoanalyze this and figure out how you can take a side character, introduce them almost halfway through the story, and make their story just as engaging to the reader as the hero, essentially adding a protagonist and driving home the point of your story. Okay, so when the story begins, we know who our protagonist is, P.T. Barnum. Let's set aside the fact that yes, this movie is not 100% historically accurate. For the first 35 minutes of the movie, we're following no character but Barnum, until a series of adventures and misadventures leads him to mistakenly believe that what will really make him happy is to have the respect and admiration of the highbrows as well as the common folk. Enter Philip Carlyle. So here comes the first rule of introducing our new protagonist. Do we, as the audience, know what this new character means to the protagonist? Yes, bringing Philip into the circus business will give Barnum the opportunity to attract a wider audience. This is important to Barnum, which means Carlyle is important to Barnum, which means Carlyle is important to the audience. This flawless scene also nails the second rule. Only bring the new character into the story when they need to appear. Imagine for a minute if from the beginning we were switching back and forth between Barnum and Carlyle's backstory. We wouldn't care about Zac Efron if his character was introduced at the beginning of the film, because we wouldn't have any context whatsoever. It would only divide the audience's attention, therefore making both characters less important to the viewer. But as it is, he doesn't enter the story until he has to, and he enters with context, giving the viewer a reason to care, which builds a great foundation for the focus switching back and forth later on. It sets you up to really care about the relationship between Zac Efron and Zendaya, Philip and Anne. Or maybe our emotions are just heightened by the brilliant score, beautiful choreography, and flawless editing. Debatable. But back to the original point. This film is a great example of adding a protagonist long after the audience knows who the real protagonist is, and making you care enough about this new character that the entire spotlight can shift to them for a lot of the story. So that's what I had to do with my NaNoWriMo 2018 novel. I always knew that the hero of my story wasn't going to be the only hero because I wanted a heroine. A particularly awesome, badass heroine that I hope you love just as much as I do when you read the book someday. So anyway, when my MC guy meets my MC girl, then and only then does she get a point of view. And then I build her story on the side for a while until the midpoint basically of the story, when the MC guy has pretty much achieved his goal, and plot twist, the MC girl's world gets flipped upside down. But now the guy and the reader cares so much about her that when the story's spotlight shines on her, we all want to know what happens next. Hopefully. My book is not flawless by any means, and of course it needs editing and rewriting probably, but it was just cool to write something that kind of doesn't fit in the mold of what you hear most writers talk about. And it was kind of awesome to figure out the science behind it and how to do it, and some good examples of stories that have done it already, so that I can go forth and write with confidence. And hopefully this video has inspired you to do the same. Comment below and tell me what's another good example of adding or switching protagonists in a story. Smash that like button if you liked this video, and be sure to subscribe to this channel if you haven't already, because I post writing videos every Wednesday and I would love to have you here in the community. Until next time, my friend, rock on.